¿Ya? A todas que nos acompañan hoy, tanto de manera presencial como virtual. A nombre del Instituto de Estudios del Caribe, les damos la más cordial bienvenida. Hoy iniciamos el ciclo 23 de las conferencias caribeñas. Las mismas son una de las gestiones más importantes de la unidad que me honro en dirigir. Estas son auspiciadas por la Oficina del Rector, la Oficina de la Decana de la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales, Radio Universidad y la Biblioteca Regional del Caribe. Las conferencias caribeñas se originaron durante el primer semestre del año electivo 2007-2008, gracias al esfuerzo encomiable del profesor Humberto García Muñiz y de todo el personal docente y no docente del instituto. Hoy, en este comienzo del ciclo 23, nos sentimos sumamente honrados en informar que durante los pasados 11 años hemos ofrecido sobre 200 presentaciones que han abarcado ponencias, conversatorios, mesas redondas, presentaciones de libros, así como simposios y presentaciones de documentales, cortometrajes y otro tipo de actividades. Hay que destacar que es la primera vez en la historia de la Universidad de Puerto Rico que una unidad adscrita a una facultad, en el caso nuestro, Ciencias Sociales, ha auspiciado durante 11 años académicos consecutivos este número de actividades con tanta variedad, riqueza de temas, enfoques, disciplinas y países. Las conferencias caribeñas ilustran el enfoque interdisciplinario y transdisciplinario del Instituto de Estudios del Caribe, al incluir temáticas de las ciencias sociales, las humanidades, los estudios culturales, las ciencias naturales, las ciencias ambientales. Es nuestra misión realizar y fomentar y divulgar las investigaciones sobre el Caribe, cumpliendo con ofrecer al público universitario y a la comunidad en general, en y fuera de Puerto Rico, una pluralidad de áreas de estudio que atiendan la complejidad y heterogeneidad social, económica, política y cultural de la región. Entre los participantes a las conferencias se han destacado profesores distinguidos de varias universidades del Caribe, Norteamérica, Europa, 2 secretarios generales de las asociaciones de estados del Caribe. Estos fueron Rubén Sillier y Alfonso Múnera, el secretario general adjunto de la Organización de Estados Americanos, Albert Ramdin, el ministro de Haití, Jacques Edouard Alexis, los 3 profesores de la Universidad de las West Indies, integrantes del panel galardonado con el Premio Nobel de la Paz en el 2007 por su trabajo sobre el cambio climático. Además, es importante señalar que miembros de la Facultad del Sistema de la UPR han tenido una amplia participación, ya sea como ponentes o como comentaristas. Además, vía Skype hemos tenido ponentes y comentaristas del exterior, incorporando así nuevas tecnologías de las telecomunicaciones a las conferencias caribeñas. Ahora voy a dejar con ustedes a la decana de la facultad, quien va a dar un corto mensaje.
Pues muy buenas tardes a todos y a todas. Yo me uno hoy a este gran evento, y yo creo que es de los muchos eventos de tanto éxito a través de tanto tiempo de este instituto. Estas conferencias caribeñas que han sido, como bien trajo la doctora Fabián, de un tiempo para acá muy reconocidas en todo el Caribe y en todo el mundo. Así que yo saludo hoy de parte de la facultad a el doctor Nicolás Farclas, que va a ser un ponente, también a las restantes personas que están hoy en la mesa aquí presidencial. También les presento a nuestra directora decana de estudios aquí que está con nosotros, la doctora Gisela Negrón, que está acompañándonos en el día de hoy. Y a nombre también del rector del recinto de Río Piedras, el doctor Ferrao, Luis Ferrao, que no pudo asistir a esta conferencia, está fuera de Puerto Rico, está en viaje así oficial, así es que lo excusamos, y yo creo que yo puedo decir de que él respalda esta actividad y siempre Rectoría ha respaldado todo lo que tiene que haber, y que nosotros a la vez en la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales nos honramos con seguir adelante con todas estas conferencias y con este programa. Les quiero decir a ustedes que yo estoy en calidad de interinato, pero aún así yo les pueden estar seguros y seguras a ustedes que les vamos a dar todo el respaldo institucional para que cada día más se haga sentir, promover, mantener toda la agenda de trabajo que tiene el instituto. Yo creo que es una gran oportunidad para nuevamente acordarnos que Puerto Rico es del Caribe, que Puerto Rico está en el Caribe, que muchas veces se nos olvida. Y profundamente estamos bien identificados porque ya trascendimos no solamente raza y etnia, sino que estamos compartiendo realmente conocimientos y conocimientos muy particulares de mucha profunda intelectualidad. Así que yo me place muchísimo de tener yo la oportunidad de saludarlos a nombre del rector y les deseo que todos y cada uno de ustedes pues puedan tener los frutos de que yo sí que sé que van a obtener una vez se finalice esta actividad y otras que vendrán en el futuro. Pues muchísimas gracias y mucho éxito.
En la tarde de hoy, el destacado profesor, investigador y amigo Nicolás Faraclas, de la Facultad de Humanidades de este recinto, nos presentará su trabajo sobre Marginalized Peoples and the Emergence of Papiamentu and Other Atlantic Creole Languages. ¿Lo dije bien? Ajá. Luego, el doctor Armando Lampe, desde Aruba, comentará la ponencia que nos va a presentar. Hay que destacar que Lampe es ministro de Educación, Ciencias y Desarrollo Sustentable en la isla que le mencioné, pero ahora los voy a dejar con la doctora Aida Verne, quien nos hará la presentación del compañero Faraclas.
Buenas tardes, good afternoon, bon tardi. Como en todas sus presentaciones y ponencias, la conferencia inaugural que presentará el doctor Faraclas, Nicolás Faraclas, promete ser una lección magistral sobre el desarrollo del Papiamentu, lengua criolla de Aruba y Curazao, lengua oficial criolla de Aruba y Curazao. A nuestro ponente, como bien señaló la compañera Ani, se unirá el doctor Armando Lampe, ministro de Educación, Ciencia y Desarrollo Sustentable de Aruba, al final de la conferencia como comentarista. Les puedo anticipar que esta conferencia será una experiencia provocativa, reveladora y sobre todo muy puntillosa en su análisis de los datos y de los hechos históricos que con demasiada frecuencia son dejados fuera de los libros de texto o sencillamente ignorados por los estudios lingüísticos tradicionales sobre el desarrollo de las lenguas criollas. Con toda seguridad habremos de entender las razones por las cuales enteros grupos de hablantes marginados han sido invisibilizados y sus voces silenciadas, quedando fuera de estas narrativas lingüísticas academicistas. El doctor Faraclas nos presentará evidencia morfosintáctica contundente que prueba la agencia de estos grupos marginados en la creación de su lengua, su historia y su cultura, pero sin ignorar cómo incidieron también en estos hechos toda una matriz de rasgos extralingüísticos importantísimos, tales como la economía, la política, la sociología, la antropología y la realidad pluricultural de la época. Quiero aprovechar esta oportunidad para poner en relieve algunos datos del doctor Faraclas. Es profesor titular de lingüística aquí en la Universidad de Puerto Rico, recinto de Río Piedras. Recibió su doctorado en lingüística en la Universidad de Berkeley, en California, en 1989. Allí fue galardonado con una beca de la Fundación Nacional de Ciencias y además recibió 2 becas Fulbright. Ha publicado más de 25 libros y 80 artículos y capítulos científicos. Ha presentado sus trabajos en investigaciones en más de 100 conferencias profesionales en sobre 40 países de África, Asia, el Pacífico, América del Sur, el Caribe, Europa y América del Norte. Este profesor ha supervisado más de 40 tesis de doctorado, en la mía entre ellas, y maestría, y también ha desarrollado y enseñado más de 50 cursos diferentes en un número considerable de áreas distintas de la lingüística, entre ellas la lingüística teórica, la descriptiva, la sociolingüística y la lingüística aplicada, no solo en la Universidad de Puerto Rico, sino también en universidades de América del Norte, América del Sur, África, el Pacífico, Europa y el Gran Caribe. En las últimas 3 décadas, el doctor Faraclas ha estado realizando investigaciones sobre lenguas criollas de la época colonial, así como promoviendo actividades de educación y alfabetización de base comunitaria para adultos y niños en el Caribe, América Latina, África y el Pacífico. Habla con fluidez inglés, español, francés, griego, alemán, tok pisin, pidgin nigeriano, pidgin de Vanuatu, pidgin de las Islas de Salomón, y posee diversos grados de conocimiento de obolo, lengua del cual escribió su gramática, portugués, árabe estándar, hausa, italiano, ruso y, por supuesto, Papiamentu. Para finalizar, quiero comentar que en el plano personal, y de esto pueden dar fe todos los que han tenido el privilegio de conocer al doctor Faraclas, estamos ante un verdadero universitario de profunda humildad, sencillez y erudición. Un profesor muy querido y respetado por sus alumnos por su inmensa generosidad intelectual. Les pido por favor que se unan a mí en un fuerte aplauso para el doctor, mi mentor, colega y querido amigo, el doctor Nicolás Faraclas.
Good afternoon, everyone. I don't know what to say after that introduction. Buenas tardes, todos y todas, y bon tardi unitur, okay? Today, I'll be speaking about marginalized peoples and the emergence of Papiamentu. You notice it's spelled with a U and an O. Those are just different orthographies, but it's pronounced the same. And the other Atlantic Creoles. We'll talk about what the other Atlantic Creole languages are, and especially the role of marginalized peoples, the ones you never hear about in the history books, the ones you never read about, the ones you never read about in the linguistics books either, in the emergence of those languages. And I'm not just speaking on my own behalf, I'm speaking on behalf of a research group that we have here that consists of many of our students. So a lot of the material I'll be presenting is actually the product of the work that we've done together. As has been mentioned before, but I'll say it in English now, the Minister for Education, Science, and Sustainable Development of Aruba will be doing the commentaries, and after we'll have time for questions. Now, why am I speaking about Papiamentu? Well, I'm speaking about Papiamentu for lots of reasons, okay? But I've had the pleasure and honor to work in the ABC Islands, A for Aruba, B for Bonaire, C for Curaçao, over the past more than a decade now. Mainly, though, not with formal linguistic research, but more with research and community activism having to do with the use of language in the schools. Because in Aruba and Curaçao and Bonaire, most of the students, when they get to school, are speaking Papiamentu. But when they get to school, they have to learn all their lessons in Dutch, which very few of them know. So we do these types of campaigns. Well, and here's an example of Papiamentu. Educación colonial sin Papiamentu ta hace difícil para comunidad nan junga un rol activo de educación. You got it? Okay, so you see where the words are coming mostly from Iberian languages, like Spanish and Portuguese. Okay, now I've also been working in these 3 islands, Aruba, Bonaire, and Curaçao, on these publications. We put out these books every year, and you're all invited as scholars to contribute to these. We publish these books in Spanish, Papiamentu, Dutch, French, English, any language of the Caribbean. We put 2 books out a year, one specialized on the islands, the ABC Islands, and another one specialized on the whole Caribbean. So you're all welcome to publish. This is something that we're doing together with the University of Curaçao. We've been doing it for the last 10 years. But we don't only do this. We also sponsor a conference called the Islands in Between Conference, which happens in a different island or a different territory of the Caribbean every year. And this year is the Año de Papiamentu, okay? This year is 2018 is the year of Papiamentu. So basically, we've done 2 Islands in Between conferences this year. We did one in March in Curaçao at the University of Curaçao, and we're going to do another one in November at the University of Aruba. Please come, okay? And feel free to present in any Caribbean language there. Several of you I know are going to go. So these are some of the interesting things that I've been doing in Aruba, Bonaire, and Curaçao over the last more than 10 years. So those are some of the reasons why I'm going to be speaking about Papiamentu. But there are other reasons why I'm going to be speaking about Papiamentu too. Okay, when we talk about Creole languages and the Creole languages of the Afro-Caribbean, Papiamentu plays a very special role because in Papiamentu we can see all of the different factors and all of the different people that contributed to Atlantic history, plus the languages of the Atlantic, of the colonial Atlantic. Now, unfortunately, in most linguists' account of these languages, and in the histories of these languages, and the histories of the Atlantic, the colonial Atlantic, and also when people talk about the cultures of the Atlantic, normally people talk about European-descended males who have property, okay? That's who writes the history books, right? But actually, I'm going to try to take it from a different point of view. What about the peoples whose voices we don't usually hear? So today, you're not going to be hearing too much about European males of the property classes. You're going to be hearing more about lots of renegades, okay? People who went renegade. You're going to be hearing a lot about maroons. You're going to be hearing a lot about women and people who didn't have any property, okay? So we're going to be talking about that. But I think we can all agree that you really can't talk about these languages or these cultures or the Afro-Atlantic without talking about the sugar plantations. Yeah, but people always talk about the sugar plantations. Why don't we try to go back a little bit and try to understand what happened before these sugar plantations actually got going, okay? So the sugar plantations basically get started after a lot of other things happen. And let's start looking at those other things because those are the situations that gave rise to a lot of the conditions from which the languages, the cultures, and the history of the Atlantic emerged. Okay, so today we're going to be going a lot of places. We're going to be going to West Africa. We're going to be going around the Caribbean. We're going to be going to North America as well in our talk and South America. But also we're going to be talking about a lot of different people. So you're going to hear things about Africans, of course, Africans who were enslaved, Africans who were free, and especially African women. You're going to be hearing about the Sephardim, Jewish people. You're going to be hearing about the Portuguese and the Dutch especially. And we're going to be focusing on 1400 to 1600. Those are the years that a lot of the foundation stones are laid for the languages and cultures and histories of the Caribbean. Okay, and what we're going to try to show is it wasn't just men from Europe of the property classes who were responsible for what happened. There are lots of other people involved whose voices need to be heard. And this has been the theme of our research group. Any of you are welcome to join our research group. We're working on this theme, and we've been doing this for many years. So if you have an interest in this area, please come and join us. Okay, the Atlantic Creoles, okay? Well, this is a group of languages. It's a group of languages that's spoken across the Atlantic. The Atlantic Creoles have more than 100 million speakers, okay? In Nigeria alone, there are more than 100 million speakers of just one of the languages, just one of the Atlantic Creoles. There are over 30 Atlantic Creole varieties, okay? We're going to be focusing on the varieties spoken on the ABC Islands here in the Caribbean. As you can see, in the Caribbean, you have about 30 varieties spoken at least. Okay. Papiamentu is one of the Atlantic Creoles, but we can divide the Atlantic Creoles up into groups, and those groups can be determined by the European language that contributes most of the words, okay? So when we talk about a language like Jamaican, for example, most of the words come from English, okay? So we can call Jamaican an Afro-Atlantic English lexifier Creole. But then when you come to Haitian, okay, here we have a language where most of the words come from French, okay? So we can call that a French lexifier Creole or an Afro-Atlantic French lexifier Creole. But we also had, we no longer have a group of languages that's now extinct whose words actually came from Dutch, okay? And those are called the Dutch lexifier Creoles, or the Afro-Atlantic Dutch lexifier Creoles. And then we have languages like Papiamentu, Palenquero, and most of their words, as you saw, come from Spanish or Portuguese, and we can call those the Iberian lexifier Creoles, or the Afro-Atlantic Iberian lexifier Creoles. Notice I say lexifier. Lexifier means that we're limiting ourselves to considering the words there, because actually, if you look at the grammatical structures, another story emerges. It's not about Europe. Actually, a lot of those underlying structures you can find all the way across West Africa and also in the indigenous languages of the Caribbean. Okay, so we'll be talking a little bit more about that too. Okay, but first, what about Creole languages? A lot of people don't like to even talk about Creole languages anymore. The reason why is because traditionally in linguistics, Creoles were part of a group of languages that were called contact languages, languages that came from contact. And we know, yeah, sure, Papiamentu came from contact between people of European descent, people of African descent, people of indigenous descent. Yeah, okay, she has a contact language. But then the other languages that weren't part of the contact language category were called natural languages. So what does that mean? Does it mean languages like Papiamentu and Creoles are unnatural somehow? And then when you look at some of these natural languages like English, what do you find? English too. If you look at the vocabulary of English, it's got most of the vocabulary of English is not Germanic, it comes from other languages. So English too is a product of contact. In fact, name me one language today that isn't the product of contact. All languages are contact languages. So this term Creole is a problematic one, but just for our purposes today, I'm going to continue to use it. If for no other reason, because when we talk about the Atlantic Creoles, we can talk about a group of languages that emerged at a particular time from a particular process that happened during the emergence of the colonial Atlantic, but also because all of these languages share certain grammatical properties, okay? And a lot of those grammatical properties don't look like European languages. They look like the ones you find in African languages or the North Arawakan languages of the Caribbean basin. Okay. Now, I tried to explain to you why I'm talking about Papiamentu. Now I'm going to try to explain to you why I'm talking about the role of marginalized peoples. Okay, well, why do I have to talk about that? Well, the problem is, if you look at the main theories that are held by people who study Creole languages, marginalized peoples are invisible, okay? So the most common theory right now is a super straight theory, which says that, no, Creole languages are just dialects of European languages. So Papiamentu should be just a dialect of Spanish or Portuguese. Story finished. Okay, so what happened to all the Africans? What happened to all the indigenous people? What happened to all the marginalized people who contributed to Papiamentu? Erased from history, erased from our studies of linguistics, okay? Then we have the universalists who claim that no, Creole languages were, when the parents of, when the enslaved reached the plantations, it was such a traumatic experience for them that their children had to reinvent language. Okay, so in other words, when children reinvent language, they use their innate language facilities, and so they're using some universal device. So Creole languages represent universal structures of language. And some people say, well, that theory was a very popular one at one time, but now most of the people who believe in universals say, no, it's really just universals of first and second language acquisition. Sorry, I'm getting a little technical here with the linguistics. Don't worry, I'll back up and talk about more later. Okay, then you have the monogenesis position. Those people say that, no, all the 100 different varieties of Atlantic Creoles can all be traced to just one language, one Afro-Portuguese Creole that was spoken on the west coast of Africa, maybe in the 14 or 1500s, okay? And then the final one is called the substrate position, and that says that finally, people from Africa are mentioned, okay? Finally, yes, Creole languages are influenced by African languages, but most of the people who hold this position, or at least the most famous people, say that it only was one language. So they try to trace everything in all the Atlantic Creoles back to one language only, like Kikongo, or Akan, or Fongbe. Okay, and so basically, we don't agree with any of these positions. In our work, what we're trying to do is put marginalized people back in the picture. not to exclude any of the other factors, but to say, yes, we have to not just talk about people from Europe, we also have to talk about these other people that I've mentioned. Yes, universals play a role. Yes, monogenesis plays a role, as you'll see. But yes, superstrates play a role. Substrates also play a role, but then there are adstrates. There are all kinds of factors, and we have to take all of these factors into consideration before we talk about how these languages emerged. Okay, so speaking of marginalized peoples, okay, one of the major groups of marginalized people were the enslaved Africans, okay? This is a language map of Africa. You can see 5 major colors, okay? The red color is a group called Niger-Congo, okay? Niger-Congo languages is a family of languages, and most of the enslaved were speaking those languages. There were enslaved that spoke other languages, but most spoke those languages. But if we look at Niger-Congo more closely, it's one sub-branch of Niger-Congo that accounts for most of the languages spoken by the enslaved. It's called the Benue-Kwa sub-branch. Okay, and here's where the Benue-Kwa sub-branch languages are spoken, right along the coast of Africa. They include many of the languages that you often hear about, okay, Yoruba, Igbo, the so-called Kwa languages, and Bantu languages are all part of the Benue-Kwa language group. Okay, so when people tell you that the ships and the plantations were towers of Babel, that's not quite true. Because people were speaking, in a lot of cases, related languages. 75% of the enslaved were speaking languages of this group, sub-branch, okay? Okay, on top of that, we have to consider the languages of the Caribbean. Okay, now, most of the languages of the Caribbean have become extinct. Okay, of the island Caribbean. But then there are languages that have survived near the Caribbean, okay, in Venezuela, in Colombia, for example. And if we look at those languages, we find many of the structures that we also find in the Atlantic Creoles. So we can consider indigenous languages also to be a source for some of those structures, as well as African languages. And the languages that we're talking about are the so-called North Arawakan languages. Now, Arawakan is an interesting family because it goes all the way down to Peru. So you see all of those blue spots? Those are all places where the Arawakan languages are spoken. The North Arawakan languages are spoken in a box, okay? And those are the languages that are most closely related to Taíno, to Caquetillo, to the other languages spoken around the Caribbean. Okay, something else that we have to talk about. A lot of people say, okay, now you have to talk about African languages and you have to make sure that you're tracing everything back to Africa. And other people say, no. You have to talk about indigenous languages and you have to trace everything back to indigenous languages. And other people say, no, you have to talk about European languages. You have to trace everything back to European languages. Okay, because you have to be authentic. Okay, there's this idea of authenticity. Okay, it has to be one language, one culture, and one identity. But actually, if there's anything that I could say is surely authentic about the people of the Caribbean, is that they're plurilingual, pluricultural, and pluri-identified. So you can speak many languages at the same time. And you can identify many ways at the same time. You can identify sometimes as a European, sometimes as an indigenous person, sometimes as an African. Okay, these kinds of these are the things that you find throughout the Caribbean, and not just in the Caribbean. You find them as well in West Africa. So if you go to West Africa, you find the same kind of pluri-identification, pluriculturalism, and plurilingualism, and the same applies to the Caribbean. So if you look at the Caribbean, the ABC Islands, that last column there, okay, the indigenous language spoken there was Caquetillo, but in very many cases, the mother would speak Caquetillo and the father might speak a language like Locono or Caliña. And then there was a trade language spoken that people use as a common language. So already you have children speaking 3 languages. So what we find in the Caribbean today is not so different than what was there in the indigenous Caribbean before. But go to West Africa, you find the same thing. Go to the Niger Delta, the area from which many slaves came, you'll find people whose mother's language is one, father's language is another. You go to the market, they speak another language. Okay, so what we're talking about here is plurilingualism, pluriculturalism, and pluri-identification as well when we talk about marginalized peoples. Okay, let's do a little bit of linguistics here, more technical linguistics. Basically, we're going to be looking at pragmatics. Pragmatics is the study of the things you assume about what another person is going to say in a conversation. It involves that at least. Okay, so basically there's this person called Grice. And he said that, in 1976, that when you speak, okay, or when you listen to somebody, you assume that they're following 4 different principles or rules or maxims. One is the maxim of quantity. Make sure your contribution is neither less nor more informative than required. And also the maximum of manner. Avoid obscurity of expression and ambiguity while being brief and orderly. Okay, so that's kind of complicated. But basically, when somebody's speaking with you in English, normally, or Spanish, you expect them, first of all, not to be vague, to get to the point, and not to say any more or less than they need to say. Okay? But actually, when you go to West Africa, it's different. Because in a lot of West African languages, people are ambiguous. They don't specify things. Why don't they specify things? Because they don't believe that the speaker should just take their meaning, put it in a package, and sell it to you like a commodity to consume passively. No, in West Africa, language is performance. You and your listener are working together to co-create the meaning. It's not just a package that you commodify and give to your listener, okay? So how do you do that? You are ambiguous. And when you're ambiguous, then the listener has to help you to figure out what's going on, okay? So an example of this is, okay, prepositions. What do we use prepositions for? We use them to talk about relations of location, for example, okay? So the boy is in the house. In is a preposition. Okay, now, in Nigerian Pidgin and in Papiamentu, 2 Afro-Atlantic Creoles, Nigerian Pidgin has an English lexifier, and Papiamentu has Iberian lexicon. You just use one general preposition usually. So in Nigerian Pidgin, the begin day for house. And that can mean the child is in, at, by, in front of. It's ambiguous, the house. And the listener has to figure it out. Okay, and then in Papiamentu, you can do the same thing. There's a general preposition, which is na. Okay, so, en mucha ta na kas, which means the child is in the house or the boy is in the house. Okay, so basically, now, some people will come in and say, yes, this is the proof that Creole languages are very simple languages. No, that's not the case at all, because in all Creole languages, you have a way to specify it if you want to. There's a way to do it. So in Nigerian Pidgin, you could say, the begin day for inside house, if you want to specify they're in the house. Or in Papiamentu, you could say, en mucha ta en cas, to say, specify they're in the house. So you can, these are not simple languages. You can say, you can specify if you want, but often you don't specify, because that's not what performance is about. Performance needs an audience. You connect with your audience, and then you create the meaning together. So this is an example from of na in Papiamentu as the general preposition. Okay. Where does the na come from? Now, this na is not just found in Papiamentu, okay? It's found in, okay, Papiamentu, it's found in the Papiamentu's Iberian lexifier Creole. It's also found in French lexifier Creoles too, like in Haitian, nang, or lang. Okay, English lexifier Creoles, like Jamaican, ina. Also in Dutch lexifier Atlantic Creoles, when they still existed, like in Hollands, na. Okay? So where does it come from? Well, if you read the books written by Creolists, they say, oh, it comes from European languages. Because in Portuguese, you can take the preposition and put it together with the feminine article, you get na. So yes, if it's found in European language, okay, story finished. But if you look a little bit closer at the other peoples involved in the context situation, you'll find that West Africans have the same article in their languages. And it's not, and it doesn't involve a preposition and an article, it's just na. Okay, for example, in Igbo, okay, you could say, Obi Naoka, he lives in Aoka, okay, in Serer, Tena Ndoke, and in Susu, Tena Timore Buma. Okay, so in all of those languages, you have a particle na that does exactly the same thing. It's a preposition. Actually, in Susu, it's a postposition, but it does exactly the same thing. So where does na come from? Oh, it's from Portuguese. No, it's from West Africa. Why do we have these silly debates? Can't you see that actually na is the perfect item that everybody would choose because it's found in both it's found in European languages and in West African languages? Why does it have to be one or the other? Okay? That's a typically European way of looking at things, okay? But in West Africa, it can be both at the same time, also in the indigenous Caribbean. Okay, now let's get to the ABC Islands, Aruba, Curaçao, Bonaire, and Curaçao. Okay, this is where Papiamentu is spoken. So let's go back there for a minute and see what we can see. Okay, more debates, okay? So when we talk about Papiamentu, it's an Iberian lexifier Creole, right? That means most of the words come from Spanish or Portuguese. So then you have the people who support Spanish, and then you have the people who support Portuguese. So they're fighting with each other. Some people say, no, it comes from Spanish. Other people say, no, it comes from Portuguese, okay? But wait a minute. At the time we're talking about, the 1400s to the 1600s, this is where we're starting, this is our starting point. What was the difference between Spanish and Portuguese anyway? Okay? What was the difference? Look at the colors. The yellowish colors are one group of languages that are very, very similar, almost dialects of each other. At this point, Spanish and Portuguese were probably dialects of each other, with Galician in the middle. Okay, and there are people who say today, actually, they're dialects of the same language as well. Okay, although don't say that to Portuguese speakers because they get mad. Okay, and look, Catalan is much further away from Spanish than Portuguese is. Okay, so why these debates where it has to be one or the other? Actually, where do we draw the line between Spanish and Portuguese anyway, especially at this time before the languages were standardized? Because when they get standardized, okay, they were standardized in such a way that they'd move apart. Another thing is that when you start looking at marginalized peoples at this time, a lot of them were moving around, okay? Sailors were moving around from Spain to Portugal, also Galicia. A lot of sailors came from Galicia, okay? And Gallego was right between Spanish and Portuguese. So how can you draw a line between Spanish and Portuguese at this time? Also, another group that we're going to get to now are the Sephardim. The Sephardim have a very particular history, okay? And basically, as you can see on the map, they were thrown out of Spain at this particular time during the Inquisition. The Sephardim, the Jews, and the Muslims were thrown out of Spain first before they were thrown out of Portugal. Okay, so a lot of them moved from Spain to Portugal. So they probably were speaking both Spanish and Portuguese. Again, where do you draw the line between the two languages? Because the Sephardim, por casualidad, became one of the groups, one of the marginalized groups that became very much involved in this whole story, as we'll see. Okay, so there's another debate. Okay, so you have people fighting bitterly, saying Papiamentu has its base, the languages of the Upper Guinea Islands, like Cape Verde. And then you say other people say, no, Papiamentu has its base in the languages spoken in Sao Tome and Principe, in the Lower Guinea Islands. So you have the people who are partisans of the Upper Guinea hypothesis, and then you have the Lower Guinea hypothesis, and they're fighting and fighting and fighting. Once again, it doesn't have to be one or the other. The people who were involved in our story were moving constantly between Upper Guinea and Lower Guinea Islands. The sailors, the Sephardim, they were moving all the time. So where do you draw the line between the languages spoken in Upper Guinea Islands and the languages spoken in the Lower Guinea Islands, okay? Both of those places have Iberian lexifier Creoles. Today they're different, but at that time, what was the difference between them? And how useful is it to talk about one as the only source for Papiamentu? Okay, let's focus a little more on the Sephardim, okay? All right, now, in Christian Europe, the Jews, just like the Romani, were given certain tasks that they could perform. Okay, so my ancestors were metal workers, okay? As Romani, we weren't able to do anything else. We couldn't own land, okay? We had to work metal, because metal was the work of the devil, okay? So we could do that, okay? And the Jews were given other types of work, like money lending and banking, okay? Which were supposed to be not good things to do, according to the Catholic Church, although the Italians and the Germans had no problem doing it, but the Spanish didn't want to do that. So they gave that work to the Jews, okay? But wait a minute, okay? Before I speak more about the Jews, let's stop, okay? Most of the Jews were not traders or financiers or bankers. Most of the Jews were struggling to make ends meet because they weren't allowed to own land. They had to depend on money, but they were barred from most professions where they could make money. Okay, so we're not talking about a group that's very wealthy, okay? We're talking about a group just like any other marginalized group, although they follow a particular trajectory that puts them in a more privileged position later, okay? But at this time, definitely not. Okay, many of the Sephardim, let's go back to our map up there, okay? Look at the arrows. They're going all over Europe. Okay, so the Jews went all over Europe, and some go to the Americas, but there are no arrows pointing down. Why? Because Africa is always erased, okay? But there were lots of Jews who actually went down towards West Africa, okay? And sometimes not by their own volition, okay? So basically, many of the Jews, after the Inquisition, were declared exiles, okay? Degredados in Portuguese. Degredados. You're going to hear more about degredados, okay? They were exiled, okay? And some of them actually made it to West Africa. Some of them were forced to convert to Catholicism, and they became the so-called New Christians. Okay, let me just read this quote because some of these quotes start to give you an idea of the stories, okay? The Christian Portuguese routinely used their expeditions overseas as an opportunity to expel their marginalized populations, including Sephardim, New Christians, Romani, Gypsies, vagabonds, and criminals who were collectively referred to as degredados. Given the fact that the living and working conditions of sailors, non-propertied settlers, and slaves were in many ways comparable, volunteers were not exactly forthcoming, and the ships were more often than not coercively crewed by impressment and forcibly filled by order of the authorities with settlers from the most marginalized sectors of the metropolitan society, including homosexuals, that is, people who were convicted of sodomy, and revolutionaries. Okay, so basically the Spanish and the Portuguese were filling their boats with the people they didn't want, okay, because they couldn't get anybody else to go. These are marginalized peoples, and we'll talk about all of these groups. Going to West Africa, there you see the Upper Guinea Islands, the first star, the second star, the mainland, West Africa, and then the third star, the Lower Guinea Islands. Okay, here's another one. From an early date, overseas territories have been regarded as suitable depositories for undesirables of metropolitan Portugal. Convicts, New Christians, Gypsies. Reference has been made to the use of lançados, that is, renegade settlers in West and East Africa, but they were found as far away as China. Exile or degredo from Portugal could be to the Atlantic islands, Sao Tome and Príncipe, Africa, Brazil, or even Portuguese India. At the first opportunity, many jumped ship at an intervening port, whereas others would escape their captors. Okay, so what was going on is they were filling their boats with these people, but as soon as the boat got to a port, they jumped ship. So they ended up going renegade in all kinds of different ways. And we're going to talk about the different ways they did this. Okay, many of them never survived. Okay, so if you were sent to Africa, basically you had probably a 70% chance of dying from disease. But some people did survive. Okay, and what happened to them? Okay, now we get from degradado to lanzado. Okay, from exile to outcast. Okay, here's where this is a very interesting part of the story of the Sephardim and other marginalized peoples. Okay, so what happened to the ones who survived? Well, a lot of them went to live in African communities. Okay, so a lot of them actually, most of these were men, married African women, and started speaking African languages, speaking African food, and became culturally African. Okay, these are the lançados, and we're going to be talking more about them as we go. Okay, but where did these lançados settle particularly? Okay, well, lançados gravitated to the rivers and estuaries of Upper Guinea and to strategic coastal anchorages. So in other words, they didn't go just anywhere. They went where the best points for trade. Okay, now we're talking about who created the Afro-Atlantic. Well, if you look at all the major cities and towns of West Africa, all the ports, these were the areas where the lançados tended to settle. So the lanzados played a major role in forging what becomes modern West Africa. But not just that. Some lanzados settled in existing African villages. Others, with the consent of relevant chiefs, founded new villages of their own. In accordance with African tradition, they were treated as guests by their chiefly hosts. Lanzados were expected to conform to the local laws and customs. Okay, most lanzados settled down with African women, and of course this scandalized the Catholic clergy. And most lanzados became cultural hybrids, while their Afro-Portuguese descendants were a people in between. Very important for us now in Papiamentu, they spoke a Portuguese Creole that was also widely used as West Africa's language of trade. And their community evolved a syncretic form of Catholicism. Most of them adapted to the West African conditions, spoke the local languages fluently, and their food and everyday lifestyles was largely African. Some lanzados went completely indigenous. Okay, so basically, once the lanzados enter the picture, the plurilingual profile of West Africa becomes more complex and more plurilingual. Because not only do you have the languages that you had there before, if you look at West Africa, but then you add a new language. Okay, so these are the languages you had there before: Ijo, Kana, Obolo, Igbo in the Caribbean. Okay, let's concentrate on West Africa. Now you add Portuguese Lexicofire Creole, and eventually English Lexicofire Creole and English in West Africa. Okay, if you look at what happened in the Caribbean, you start with the indigenous languages, and then you add Papiamentu, English Lexicofire Creole, and other languages. Okay, so basically, as you go on, plurilingualism becomes more complex instead of less complex. All right, another really important part of this story is women, okay? And women are usually not even mentioned. Maybe one or two women in the historical narrative, and linguists hardly ever talk about women, okay? Okay, but in West Africa, you can't understand economics without understanding what women are doing, because women are in control of the markets of West Africa. They control the markets. They control food production. Okay, so, and when the lanzados came, it was no different. Okay, Silvestrini says, because women's political mobilization in the Caribbean and the rest of the Afro-Atlantic often focused on the needs of their families and immediate communities, it was disregarded as unimportant. Their stories were not incorporated into mainstream historical discourse because their stories were told in unconventional ways, far from the kinds of sources searched by historians and archives. Subtle and intimate forms of resistance were rooted in women's lives. We're going to be talking about some of those forms of resistance, and often passed unnoticed. For women, the public and personal are tightly related, and their forms of resistance are more difficult to identify unless approached from the perspective of women's experience. Okay, now let's back up and look at what was going on in the Afro-Atlantic at this time. Okay, the first thing you have to understand is that of the people arriving in the Americas, the Europeans made a very small part of those numbers, okay? Most people were coming from West Africa. Okay, so more than 80% of the arrivals to the Americas from the 1400s to the 1700s were from Africa rather than Europe. Which means that when these Spanish and Portuguese men arrived in the Americas, who did they live with? Who did they cohabit with? Who did they have children with? Mostly African and indigenous women. Okay, and of course, just look around Puerto Rico and you'll see the result. Okay. Also, more than 90% of them were men. Okay, so this, of course, means that most of them went renegade. They cohabited with indigenous and African women and had to some degree or another, conform to indigenous and African lifeways. Especially their children, because their mothers were teaching the children. Okay, so during the first 3 centuries of colonization of the Atlantic, the only thing that stood between these European men and death was the African or indigenous woman and her knowledges and lifeways that they were cohabiting with. She was the one who was keeping them alive, okay? Because she knew how to survive in this environment. They didn't know what to do because they were coming from Europe, okay? And these women took advantage of their position. And if you look at Portuguese, if you look at Spanish in Puerto Rico, if you look at the lifeways of Puerto Ricans, the ways that Puerto Ricans deal with time and other things, okay? You'll see that there's a very strong African influence. There's a strong indigenous influence, okay? On the surface, it may look like it's Spanish, but underneath, the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean are still very much alive. And you are the proof of that, okay? And also, people of African descent are really very much still alive in all Puerto Ricans, no matter what you may look like on the outside. Okay, so what these women did was something very subversive. But again, women's resistance is normally not talked about. What these women did was they actually subverted the whole Spanish and Portuguese colonial project. They indigenized and Africanized the bloodlines and the languages and the cultures of the Spanish and Portuguese colonies. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But of course, it's not just historians who erase women. Linguists are really good at this too. So we have Chomsky, whose basic theory is that children just learn language on their own using what's in their brains. What does that do? It totally erases mothers from the picture, who are main teachers of language. And mothers begin to teach us not when we're born, while we're still inside their bellies. We know this from recent research that shows that children are learning as they're in the womb. But of course, in linguistics, that's totally erased. Nobody talks about that. Secondly, we have among Creolists this idea that children reinvent language. And that's how we get Creoles. Where are the mothers? Again, it's erasing women. So we have motherless linguistics and motherless Creolistics. That's another reason why we have to talk about women in this presentation. And then when you look at Creole languages, the functions that they serve are a lot of the same functions that women's language serves. So if you look at the way that people use Creole languages, in many ways it's the ways that women, it's very similar to the way that women use their languages. Okay, so we're talking about therapeutic use of language, informatic use of language, cybernetic use of language, didactic use of language, et cetera, et cetera. So we talk about two types of agency with women and two types of agency in general in the Atlantic. We talk about a renegade agency and a maroon agency. A renegade agency is the type of agency that typified the first years of colonization, the first couple hundred years, from like 1400 to 1600. And then the second type of agency typifies what comes after 1600. Okay, when we're talking about the big sugar plantations. So there's a whole period before where these marginalized peoples are doing really subversive things, especially women, where they're, like I said, subverting the languages and cultures of the, and bloodlines of the Portuguese and Spanish. But then after the Dutch and the English get into the picture, you can see women doing it again, but in another way, which we'll talk about later. Okay. Here's an example of a lanzado woman, okay? So Disney says that lanzados regularly travel for hundreds of kilometers along the rivers and across the portages of Upper Guinea, which means that it really makes no sense to talk about Upper Guinea Islands versus Lower Guinea Islands when we talk about the source of Papiamentu. Lanzados were going everywhere. They knew the country and the people far better than visiting Europeans. Because of this and because of their mixed cultural heritage and local language skills, they were the usual intermediaries between the European and the West Africans. Lanzados also traded on their own accounts. Among the most successful were several women, including the formidable Viviana Vaz de Cacheu. In the late 17th century, lanzados were not only directly involved in agriculture, lanzados were not generally involved in agriculture because African rulers normally would not let them have land. We'll talk a little more about that too. Okay, so let's get back to the Sephardim now, okay? So let's pick up that strand of this. Okay, so here's an example of Sephardim moving from Portugal to West Africa. So in 1493, the king of Portugal decides to impose a very heavy tax on the Jews because he wants to finance his colonies off the coast of Africa, Sao Tome and Principe. So when those families who couldn't pay were forced to give up their children, and he put their children on a boat and sent them all to Sao Tome, 2,000 children. Of those 2,000, only 600 survived. But some of those children who survived intermarried with the Africans who were there on the island, and they eventually became the ruling class of the island. they eventually became the mulatto, planter, and merchant class of the island. Okay, so you can see this double-edged role that the Sephardim are playing here. Okay, similar things happen in the Cape Verde. Okay, so you get a mulatto class that emerges from these lanzados as well, and many of them of Sephardic origin, but others not. Okay, so what did these lanzados do? They were helping to integrate Portuguese and other Europeans into the vibrant ancient trade networks of West Africa. Okay, so if you know anything about West Africa, you've got to know something about trade. Okay, before the Europeans got to West Africa, it was one of the most vibrant places for trade on the planet. West African markets are phenomenal to see. We go to Ghana every year. Come with us to Ghana, and we'll show you markets that you won't believe. Markets, when you stand here, you can't see the end of the market. It goes for kilometers. Okay, West Africans have always been very much involved in markets, and which group of West Africans are the most heavily involved? It's women. They control the markets. Okay. So when the Europeans came, they weren't introducing anything new in terms of the idea of markets to West Africans. They were just introducing a few more different goods, okay, and different types of trade. But, interesting, what was the language used in the market between the Europeans and these lanzados? It was probably some form of Afro-Caribbean Portuguese lexifier Creole. And we can say that's one of the sources of Papiamentu. Not the only source, but one of the sources. Okay, so let's, now time to do a little more linguistics, okay? Don't be afraid, it's not bad. Okay. So we saw this example already, but we were talking about the preposition. Let's talk about the noun. Look at house. Where's the article? No article. Where's the plural marker? No plural marker. In fact, again, you can be ambiguous. Let your listener figure out if it's plural or singular or not. Let your listener figure out if it's definite or indefinite or not. Co-create the meaning with your listener. It's a performance, okay, with your audience. Okay, so, and if we're talking about authentic African speech practices, this ambiguity, this cultivation of ambiguity, would be one of them. Okay, so when people in the Caribbean do this, okay, this is part of their African heritage. Okay, in any case, so house. So if I say, the Pekin day for house, it could be the child is by the house, a house, one house, or some houses. The listener has to figure it out. Okay, and the same in Papiamentu. And mutatanakas. Kas can mean a house, the house, one house, some houses. But if you want to, you can specify it. Okay, it's not like these languages are somehow impoverished and they don't have ways to do it. They have ways to do it, but people choose not to do it because let the listener do something. Okay? Any case, so in Nigerian Pidgin, you can pluralize it by saying di house dem. And in Papiamentu, ekas nang. And look at the word that they use for the plural, nan and dem. It's also the word that means they in both languages, okay? So what you can see are strikingly similar patterns here, and in West African languages like Yoruba, you have the same pattern, okay? To say house, you say ile, okay? But if you want to say the houses, you use they after house. You say ile won, okay? So won means they. So in other words, this is a West African language pattern that comes through not just in Nigerian Pidgin, but an English lexifier Creole, also in Papiamentu, which is an Iberian lexifier Creole. Okay, so what happens with sugar production? Okay, now let's talk a little bit about sugar production. Well, the easiest solution for the Europeans would be to cultivate sugar in West Africa. So in the 1400s, they tried, but they failed, okay? So why did they fail? Why couldn't Europeans start sugar plantations in West Africa? Well, first of all, nobody would give them the land they needed, okay? Because people in West Africa knew what the source of their wealth was, their land, okay? Secondly, though, African workers would come to the plantation, they would realize they were being treated like slaves, and many of them would just run away. They became maroons, okay? Or sometimes they'd run away with the harvest, okay? And also, the renegades we were talking about, the lanzados, these Afro-Portuguese people, they would also ally many times with the with West Africans and Maroons to oppose Europeans taking their land and to colonize their countries. So the colonization of West Africa doesn't happen until the 1800s. So that's 400 years of successful resistance by West Africans to colonization. In your history books, they say, here come the Europeans, and it's over. West Africa is colonized. No, West Africa wasn't colonized till the 1800s. There were 400 years there where the West Africans successfully resisted. And the people we're talking about, the renegades and the Maroons, play a key role in that story. Okay, neither Portugal nor any other European power, for that matter, exercised genuine political domination over any significant segment of West Africa in the pre-modern era. It wasn't until the 1800s. The Portuguese made no serious attempt to establish permanent settlements on the coast, even though several proposals to this end were put forward. The promoters of these schemes seem to have had in mind plantation colonies. However, African rulers invariably turned down any proposal that would allow Portuguese to settle outside the designated feitorias, which are the slave trading settlements. Okay, so what did the Europeans do? Okay, they gave up on West Africa and they went to the islands offshore. The first island they went to was Madeira. And by 1490, the small island of Madeira became the world center for sugar production. And it involved Sephardim, both in the role of slaves or laborers, as well as plantation owners and financiers, and a lot of other people, but they were using mainly indigenous and European slaves, and that didn't work out. So basically, Madeira, for other reasons too, some of the sugar cane was diseased, so the Portuguese moved to another set of islands, the Lower Guinea Islands of São Tomé, Príncipe and Annobon, to plant their sugar. And by the early 1500s, these islands, the São Tomé, Annobon, and the Lower Guinea Islands became the center for sugar production, the world center for sugar production. So there you see those islands there. But what happened? Okay, while the Portuguese were establishing plantations in São Tomé, they were also establishing plantations in an island called Annobon. Well, what happened in Annobon was a lot of slaves ran away and became Maroons. Okay, then the Maroons allied themselves with the enslaved on the plantations, and they overturned the whole colonial regime and the whole plantation regime. They threw all the Portuguese out. They threw all the planters out. They threw all the Sephardim out. They threw all the priests out. And they wouldn't allow anybody from Europe to come onto their islands for the next 200 years. This is the first successful slave revolt, permanent slave revolt that happened in the Afro-Atlantic. And where did you read about that one? We read about Haiti 300 years later. Haiti changed world history. It was very significant. But the people in Haiti had a whole history. Okay, so when the people in Haiti made their revolt, made their wonderful revolution, they had a whole 300 years of experience that was in their tradition of resistance. It goes all the way back to places like Annobon. Okay, but let's put women into this picture now. Okay, so very early on the plantations in São Tomé, the women got involved in a very subtle form of resistance. Okay, so basically, these plantations were supposed to be growing sugar, okay? Now the women, everybody was growing sugar. Nobody was growing food. So the women went to the plantation owners and said, look, you don't have to feed us. You don't have to get food from somewhere else. Give us all the land you don't want, the swampy land, the mountainous land. Let us have little plots. Let us grow our own food. Then you don't have to worry about feeding us. Everybody wins, right? And the plantation owners said, okay. So these women took these little plots of land, awful land, the worst land that nobody else wanted. They took these little plots of land. And of course, these women had lots of spare time, right? Enslaved women have lots of spare time. They don't have spare time. They took the few hours they had every day, and they farmed these plots, and they used their traditional West African knowledges to create abundance from those plots. So they grew more food than they needed. So if you have more food than you need, what do? You start a market. And of course, these women have a long tradition of marketing. And they started markets. So these women actually exercised a very strong form of resistance by establishing these small plots that they could grow food, and then the markets. Okay? And interesting, these markets are really fascinating. Okay, so Meyer says, During slavery, enslaved women, despite overwhelming odds, had been engaging in semi-independent economic activities. It was the plantation system itself which inadvertently gave them the main resource for such initiatives, for the priority which the macroeconomic system placed on cash crops for export to the exclusion of food crops for local consumption resulted in slaves having to assume responsibility for feeding themselves. Female slaves, as a consequence, enjoyed legal entitlement to their own provision grounds. Women labored hard and profitably on their own fields. As food producers and distributors, they came to play a pivotal role in the domestic economy. So these women started to become major actors in the local economy. These markets would draw thousands of people, okay? And they weren't just, so think about it. These slaves are on this plantation, those slaves are on that plantation, the maroons are out somewhere in the forest. But when the markets happened, everybody came together. People from different plantations could establish connections. The maroons could establish connections with the enslaved. So what do you think happened in these markets? It wasn't just about food. It was about culture, lots of dancing, lots of singing, but also it was about politics. People started plotting their revolts. So the revolt in Anobong didn't come from nowhere. Women played a key role in it, but they played a role that isn't talked about. Now, don't think the Europeans didn't realize what was going on in these markets. They realized, but they couldn't stop it, because if the Europeans stopped the market, the Europeans would have nothing to eat, because the Europeans became completely dependent on these markets too. Are you going to wait for the boat to come from Lisbon with all the wormy flour and supplies, if it even gets there? No. So they were depending on this food too. These women had the planters and the Europeans by their bellies. Talmage says, the possessions which many slaves had were all the rewards of hard work, not in their master's fields, but in their own plots and gardens. Female slave-controlled markets developed everywhere. In towns, slaves sold their goods from door to door. Slaves thronged the ports, buying and selling. While such freedom made many whites and men in authority uneasy, they had come to depend on this independent slave commercial presence. The whites might have disliked this remarkable slave commercialism, they also needed its produce. Islands and regions were fed by slave activities. Nor was this simply a matter of food, for slaves made and sold a range of house-made items as well in these markets. Okay, so what happens in Sao Tome? The same thing that happened in Anobong. Okay, so a lot of slaves run away and become maroons. Then in the women's markets on the weekends, they start to plot together with the enslaved on the plantations, and they overthrow the plantation regime. So there was another complete overthrow of a plantation regime in Sao Tome as well, so that to the point where the Portuguese had to move the capital of the Lower Guinea Islands from Sao Tome to Príncipe. Okay, again, another victory. By 1578, Amador had led a revolt against the Portuguese, and it was successful. And what happened? The center for sugar production was Sao Tome at the time. It shifted to Brazil. A lot of the planters in Sao Tome went to live in Brazil after that, some of them via Amsterdam. So we're moving now from West Africa to the Americas, okay? So we're moving from here to there, okay? Northeast Brazil in particular. Okay, but then when we get to Brazil, okay, we're talking about the end of the 1500s now, okay? Well, Brazil has its own renegade stories, okay? From the very beginning, Brazil was established as a place of interest by the Portuguese in 1500. They didn't do much until about the end of the 1520s to actually establish a presence in Brazil. Why? Because they were much more interested in all the things they were doing in India and China. At this time, the Portuguese were expanding all the way across to Asia. So they weren't paying much attention to Brazil, but the French were paying attention to Brazil. And the French had established Rio de Janeiro, and actually the Portuguese became afraid that the French were going to make Brazil their colony, so they sent expeditions, okay? But if you start looking in the history of Brazil, you find the same fascinating stories of renegades, European people who go renegade, who live and become indigenized, or live together with people of African descent and become Africanized. Okay, so here's this guy, and they always call him the Bachelor of Cananeia, okay? Why do they always call him the Bachelor? Because he never married. I wonder why. Okay, of course, nobody mentions gay people, LGBTI people in the histories, so we have to kind of dig, and we have to kind of assume different places, but we have to try to figure out what's going on in these histories and dare to speculate that actually LGBTI people were involved in a major way. Okay, so here's this guy. Okay, the Bachelor of Cananea. We're talking about 1501, okay? And he's on top of being LGBTI, he's also a new Christian. He's also a Sephardi, okay? The Bachelor of Cananea is unofficially accredited with the founding of the first 3 cities in Brazil, Cananea, Iguape, and São Vicente. The Bachelor is known to be a new Christian, exiled to Brazil circa 1501, a common destination for the new Christians, expelled by the Portuguese. In Brazil, he settled among the indigenous people and went on to found São Vicente, which flourished as a town under his guidance and leadership. When the Portuguese conquistador finally gets there, okay, in 1532, that's Afonso de Sousa, all of a sudden, he's the one who founds the city. Okay, so the Bachelor is erased from history, and we replace the name of Afonso de Sousa, okay? A year after Afonso left, and the Bachelor of Cananea comes back, and he takes the city back over, and then founds another city called Enguaguaçu, or Iguape, in 1536. Amazing stories. Go to the archives, you'll find all these amazing things of people who are not propertied men of European descent. All these people who did all these other kinds of interesting things in all of these places we're talking about. Okay, so by 1600, the northeast of Brazil had become the center for world sugar production because a lot of those planters moved over from São Tomé. But from the very beginning, you had lots of slaves running away. And in Brazil, there's lots of places to run away to. Some of those settlements of quilombos, they called, settlements of Maroons in Brazil had over 100,000 people in them. 100,000 Maroons in one settlement, okay? Okay, in any case, something else happened in Brazil. Between 1620 and 1650, the Dutch took over northeastern Brazil and wanted to establish a new type of sugar production regime, a more capitalist type of sugar production regime, okay? And they allied themselves with the Sephardim, and a lot of these new style plantations were started in northeastern Brazil. Okay, once the slaves and the Maroons realized what was going on, this was a new form of labor exploitation, which is qualitatively more intense than what they'd known before. They said, no, we don't want any part of this. So they helped the Portuguese reconquer northeastern Brazil. So the Portuguese take northeastern Brazil back in 1650, and they chase out the Dutch and the Sephardim. So where did the Dutch and Sephardim go? The Caribbean. Okay, so now we're finally at the Caribbean. Okay, so after all that, we get here. Okay, sorry I had to take you on such a long journey, but you can't understand what's going on in the Caribbean without that. Okay, in any case, here we are in the Caribbean. Where in the Caribbean? Barbados, Martinique, Guadeloupe. Barbados? That little island? I mean, I have nothing against Barbados. Barbados is a beautiful place, right? But you're going to do major sugar production on a little island like that? Why? Why not choose a place like Puerto Rico, which has much more land? Okay? Yeah, okay. So, interesting, because the Dutch went to this little island and used it and made it like an incubator, okay? In other words, they protected it from the Spanish. They wouldn't let the Spanish come and drive the English out. Plus, they financed it. They gave money to these planters, like it was like free money almost. They knew these planters weren't even going to pay it back, but they gave them money anyway. They gave them slaves. They established a major slave depot in Curaçao and in Statia, and they supplied these planters with slaves. And many times they knew they were going to take a loss. They didn't care. They didn't care because they had a longer view of what was going to happen. So basically, and then the Sephardim and the Dutch already have all the technical expertise in sugar production from Brazil and São Tomé and Madeira. So they put it all together on these English and French islands. Notice these are not Dutch islands. The Dutch specialized in the trade of slaves, and also the Dutch specialized in the marketing of the sugar and the transport of the sugar, which is where the real money was. Let the English and French do the production. We'll do the stuff that makes the money. Okay, so that's basically what the Dutch were doing at this point. Slaves also were a major source of money, so they got involved in the slave trade. This is where Curaçao begins to come into the picture. So Curaçao was a major slave trading base. Notice I haven't mentioned Bonaire and Aruba. too much so far. The reason why I haven't mentioned Bonaire and Aruba is because they weren't really settled until the late 1800s. So we're talking about a later settlement there. Okay. And I'm really focusing on a time before that until the end of the presentation. So they succeed. Okay, but let's back up a minute. So here the Dutch come, they ally with the English to make these, to create these sugar plantations on Barbados. Okay, now let's go back to one of our first questions. Who drives history? Who creates history? Why did they have to come all the way here to that little island to create their sugar plantations? Why? Because Africans wouldn't let them do it in West Africa. That was African agency. These are Africans creating history. It's not the Europeans deciding where to go. It's the Africans telling the Europeans where to go. Okay, then they get to Sao Tome, and they start their sugar plantations there. What happens? Okay, the Maroons, okay, drive them out. It's not the Europeans saying, oh, let's do it here. It's the Maroons saying, not here, go somewhere else. Okay? Then they get to Brazil and try it in Brazil, and the Maroons do it again with the help of women in their markets. Okay? So in other words, who's driving history? We read the history books, oh, the Europeans are in charge, oh, they decided to go here, then they decided to go there. No, those decisions were based on other people's agency, the people you never hear about. And that's what we're talking about here in this presentation. Okay, so Okay, so now here we are in the Caribbean. There's Aruba, Curaçao, and Bonaire, Aruba, Curaçao, and Bonaire, the ABC Islands. Also Barbados, they're circled. But the French islands too are involved in this, Martinique and Guadeloupe. I didn't circle them, but they're much involved with this. So what the Dutch did with the English, they also did with the French in Martinique and Guadeloupe. Okay, so why Barbados? Well, after their experiences in West Africa, and Annobon, and Sao Tome, and Brazil, okay, they realized they had to do something about this African and Maroon agency and women's agency. So they said, okay, let's start a prison camp. We need an island that's small enough that we can use it like a prison camp, like a labor camp, like a concentration camp. And that's what they turned Barbados to a concentration camp, where they could experiment with more intensive forms of labor exploitation, more capitalist forms of labor exploitation, and it was small enough and flat enough where they could keep an eye on everyone, or so they thought. Of course, they couldn't. Okay. So why Barbados? Well, the reason why is because of the agency of these marginalized people. They forced the Europeans to do it on that little island because that's the only place they could do it. And why the English and the Dutch? We're talking about the years from like 1640 to 1690. Did you ever hear of the Anglo-Dutch Wars? There were 3 of them, 3 Anglo-Dutch wars during this time. The Dutch and the English were at war with each other. The French and the English and the Dutch were at war with each other. All the Europeans in Europe were fighting with each other. But here in the Caribbean, they're supporting each other. Why? Because West Africans, renegades, Maroons, women are so powerful and such powerful agents in history that the Europeans have to leave all of their wars behind in Europe and band together when they get to the Caribbean. Okay? And so this strange alliance is only understandable if you recognize the agency of renegades and Maroons. Now, this brings us to another renegade story, okay, closer to home. Okay, so if you want to know why Donald Trump was elected president of the United States, here's an answer. What does Donald Trump have to do with this? Okay, you'll see. Okay. Another story, another forced migration of peoples from England to North America. Okay, so the English and the Dutch were trying to get colonies in the New World since the 1400s. Or the end of the 1400s and the early 1500s. But they weren't allowed to by the Spanish. The Spanish chased them out, and the indigenous people chased them out every time they tried. So the French were eventually chased out of Brazil as well. Okay, so the English tried to establish in the late 1500s a colony in Roanoke in Virginia. Now notice that arrow. That arrow is a different arrow from the one that comes from Portugal and Spain. The migration of peoples out of Portugal and Spain, the exile, was usually of prisoners, people, homosexuals, Sephardim, gypsies, etc. People who could be identified as criminals. But England tried a different policy. They systematically took the land away from the people of England, took people's land away, turned them into vagabonds, and then shipped them off. So this is a real different kind of colonial policy, where people who've done no crime are actually shipped by their millions to the New World. And you can see how they were treated in Roanoke. So this is the first attempt by the English to colonize North America, Roanoke, okay? We're talking about, since the 1580s, the British were trying to do this, the English, still the English, they're trying to do this. Okay, the governor of Roanoke was John White. And the people of Roanoke, just like on the other plantations, they were supposed to be growing cash crops. They weren't supposed to be growing food, so they had no food. They were waiting for the food to come from England. The food never came. Okay, so the captain went to England to get food. He got distracted for 3 years. Then he came back, and there was nobody left in Roanoke. Okay, and here's where Sir Walter Raleigh comes into the picture. These are the people who write history, right? So Sir Walter Raleigh said, yes, those indigenous people, they killed all the Europeans. Okay, and this is the story that you learn about Roanoke, the place where all the Europeans were killed by the indigenous peoples. But then if you look a little bit closer, you'll find that in all the archives it says that the relations between the indigenous peoples and the Europeans was very positive. They were very positive in this colony. On top of it, if you look at the names of the indigenous peoples in this area today, a lot of the names are the names of the settlers in Roanoke. So what happened? Those settlers did what the Portuguese did in West Africa. They went to live with the indigenous people where they could eat. Okay. So basically, you can't write that in a history book. You can't write in a history book that a European turned their back on European civilization and became African or became indigenous. Okay, you can't write that in a history book, but this was a major part of the history we're talking about, and was a major driver of the history we're talking about. Okay, now they failed in Roanoke, so they kept trying. So they went to Jamestown. Okay, Jamestown. So we all, and if you read them in your American history class, or even in your Puerto Rican history class, they probably teach you about Jamestown, because you probably learn more about the United States than you do about Puerto Rico in your history class. Okay, Jamestown, the first permanent settlement of the English in the Americas, okay? But they don't tell you what was happening in Jamestown, okay? In Jamestown, the same thing happened that happened in Roanoke, okay? The people couldn't eat. They had nothing to eat because they were being forced to grow stuff they couldn't eat. So a lot of them, 1 in 7 of them, were running away to the indigenous people. And the ones who stayed in the colony and didn't run away to the indigenous people and become renegades, they were dying of starvation. You have all kinds of stories. Story about the guy who took his wife, killed her, salted her, and ate her bit by bit. Okay? Or the people who dug up graves and ate the corpses. Okay? This was in the historical record. You never got taught that in your class, did you? Okay? If this had been Africans doing this, you sure would have read about it. If it was indigenous people, you surely would have read about it. But if Europeans start becoming cannibals, you never read about it, okay? And they said, oh, yeah, but this was all hearsay, you know, just like the trial today, okay? Yeah, okay. It's all just what these women are saying, okay? So this is all just what these people are saying. But a few years ago, they found Jamestown. They found it. And they dug up the graves, and they looked at the bones. And the marks on the bones could only have been made by butchering. So now we have actual physical proof that the Europeans in Jamestown were eating each other. Okay. By some miracle, this colony survived. It's a whole story in itself. I'm not going to go into the details, because I want to connect it back to Curaçao. Yeah, why is he going to North America? Are we supposed to be talking about Curaçao? Yeah, I know. Okay, we're getting there. Okay. The Europeans who survived survived in Jamestown ran away to the indigenous people, okay? And that became very dangerous. Then they started bringing Africans, and they started running away to indigenous people. And now the people who ran away to live with the indigenous people, Africans, people of African descent, people of European descent, people of indigenous descent, they started joining together, and they were threatening the Virginia Company, the colony, the colonial authorities. So very quickly, the Virginia Company replaced the first governor, Sir George Percy, with Thomas Gates, Governor Thomas Gates and Deputy Governor Thomas Dale, the two Thomases. Okay. Yeah, the two Thomases. Okay. Now, these weren't just any Thomases. Okay, these two people that they chose as governors had spent a great amount of time in the Netherlands, okay, as Calvinists, okay? And what they did when they were in the Netherlands, they studied this, a whole new philosophy that was emerging out of the Netherlands about this time, of capitalist economics, but also of racialized slavery, okay? So basically, what they did was, they went back to Jamestown and they prevented any Europeans from running away to indigenous people, any Africans running away to indigenous peoples, okay? They made strict laws where you could be punished with brutal tortures if that happened, okay? So this became the apartheid foundations of North America, okay? So when people vote for Trump, what are they doing? Okay, basically, they're repeating this story, okay? The people of European descent who are not property, poor people, okay, who think that they have the God-given right to keep indigenous people in their place and people of African descent in their place, so they don't take what's theirs. Okay, anyway, we have to keep going because time is getting short. Although, unfortunately, Dr. Lampe will not be able to join us by Skype. He has another commitment, so but we'll keep going. Okay. Okay, so so basically this is what happened. The slavery system in Virginia was changed from one where they used Europeans as slaves to one where they used Africans as slaves, okay? And the rest, the history, I think you know. Okay, so England and Holland became a center for a new way of thinking about economics, capitalist economics, and a new way of thinking about how you organize society, by race. Okay, and then why Barbados? Again, another answer to that. The first governor who established Barbados was also a Calvinist who had lived many years in the Netherlands. Okay, so this connection is really interesting. Okay, Sir William Corton. Okay, established Barbados from 1624 to 1625, and he received a lot of military and financial support from the Netherlands, and he used Barbados as a testing ground for these new ideas about how to do capitalist sugar plantations with racialized slavery. In the beginning, they tried to use European labor and indigenous labor, but they very quickly went over to African labor. And they relied on the Dutch models for pre-capitalist sugar production that had been developed in Brazil. And they thought that Barbados was small enough and flat enough so that the enslaved could not escape. But of course, West Africans and Maroons found very ingenious ways to escape the plantation system. And one thing that happened was that people built rafts, and the currents from Barbados carried them over to St. Vincent. When they got to St. Vincent, these enslaved people of African descent met up with the indigenous peoples of the island. And the indigenous peoples of the island welcomed them. At least one group of them did. And slowly, those indigenous peoples became phenotypically African while they were speaking indigenous languages and practicing a lot of indigenous culture. So basically, this is where you get this new ethnic group called the Black Caribs or Garifuna. An interesting group of people that is, has a lot to do with what we're saying about Maroons and the importance of Maroon resistance. I'm not going to go further into that, so I can leave some time for you to ask questions. But in any case, if you're interested, this is another fascinating group to study. Okay. What was happening now by the 1700s, okay? Barbados succeeded. But then the English took what they had learned in Barbados and applied it to Jamaica, and Jamaica became the crown jewel of the British Empire. The French did the same. They took what they learned about sugar production in Martinique and Guadeloupe, and they applied it in Haiti. And Haiti became, for them, the biggest accumulation of capital in human history. And the Dutch did the same in Suriname. They started sugar production there. So the three major sugar-producing colonies, Haiti, Jamaica, and Suriname, in the 1700s, because of Maroon resistance, because of the resistance of women, because of the women's markets, etc., they became ungovernable. So the whole history of the 1700s, if you read Jamaica, Haiti, and Suriname, it was one revolt after another. Oh, seriously, they had to militarize these places. These places were totally militarized societies. And it got to the point that in Suriname and Jamaica, they had to sign treaties. The Dutch and the English had to sign treaties with the Maroons, recognizing their sovereignty and their sovereignty over territory in Jamaica and Suriname. And of course, in Haiti, you know what happened, okay? The French, it blew up right in the French, the face of the French, and Haiti became the first successful overturn of a plantation regime in the Americas. But we know that Anobo and Sao Tome happened a couple hundred years before that. Okay, let's do a little bit of linguistics now. Okay, look at this particular construction. Okay, in West African languages, also many indigenous languages, you can take verbs and string them together without any conjunctions. So, okay, for example, in Nigerian Pidgin, you can say, in the sit down read book. Okay, that means he sat and read a book, okay, or he's sitting and reading a book. Look, between sit down and read, there's no conjunction. You can put the verbs together like that. And in Papiamentu, you could do the same. Eta sinta lesa buki. So it's the very same construction, even though the words are coming from different languages. Nigerian Pidgin from English, Papiamentu from Spanish and Portuguese. You get the same construction, which is a very West African construction. Also one that typifies the indigenous languages of this area. Okay, another example, Nigerian Pidgin. John do enter room, take book, commode, go. Okay, in Papiamentu, John andrenta camber, coge buki, salibai. Okay, same construction. Here you have four verbs together without any conjunctions. Okay, let's go. Okay, now finally back to the ABC Islands. Okay. Okay, now, when we get to Curaçao, it becomes the major slave trading depot of the Dutch in the Caribbean. Okay, but what the Dutch were doing based in Curaçao and also in Statia was they were promoting a new form of racialized slavery and capitalist sugar production. Okay, so according to the Dutch, the Spanish and Portuguese had failed in their empires. Why? Because they allowed themselves to become indigenized and Africanized. So that agency that we talked about of African women and indigenous women among the Spanish and Portuguese, the Dutch saw what was going on and said, we have to stop that. So they established strict apartheid. So when the Dutch got to Curaçao, they wouldn't share their language or their religion with the enslaved. No, you can't learn Dutch and you can't practice our religion. Okay? So what did that mean? Okay, well, it meant that finally what people speak. They couldn't speak Dutch, weren't allowed to speak Dutch, but look, it wasn't just the Dutch who settled in Curaçao, it was also Sephardim. And those Sephardim knew the Portuguese Creole from West Africa, a lot of them knew it. And a lot of the enslaved knew that Portuguese lexified Creole too. So they started speaking that with each other. And that's one of the main sources for Papiamentu. Not the only one, but one of the main sources of Papiamentu. So that's how that history ties in with the history of Curaçao. Okay, so for example, okay, I'm not going to go too heavy into this because we don't have time, but basically, if you look at the tense modality and aspect system in both Papiamentu and the English lexified Creoles, it's very similar. We get don in Finnish. In English lexified Creoles, you get kava. In Papiamentu, you get de, da, a, or de from B. In English lexified Creoles, you get ta from estar. Where you get go, in English lexified Creoles, you get tabai, bai, which means go. When you get bin in the English lexified Creoles, you get taba, which is from estaba. Okay, so basically you find many of the same characteristics, and all of these characteristics are found in a whole range of West African languages all the way across the southern coast of Nigeria, for example. Wherever you see a plus, these features are present in those West African languages. Okay, I'm not going to get into the details, but look at this one. Okay, Papiamentu, makana. Okay, that means I what. For me, puts it, makes it mean that it either happened sometime in the past or it's completed, and then kana means walk. Okay, Now, interesting. Another aspect of African language, another African language practice is what we call double voicing, where you can use the same words to project two different identities. So here, when you say makana, if there's a European listening to it, they'll probably interpret it as past. But if there's a West African listening to it, they'll probably interpret it as completive aspect. I've already done it. And of course, you have the very same marker in Chi, Ashanti Chi. So if you say mananti in Ashanti Chi, it means I've already walked. Okay, so if the Dutch weren't going to teach their religion to the enslaved, that left the field wide open for the Spanish priests from Venezuela and Colombia to come and evangelize the enslaved as Catholics. Okay, so that's what they did. But these priests didn't use Dutch. They used Papiamentu to do their work. So they translated the Bible into Papiamentu. Can you imagine? This early on, a translation in a Creole language of the Bible. They translated all their texts and they did literacy classes. People reading and writing this Creole language, something that didn't happen with other Creole languages. So this made Papiamentu special, okay? But why? Because of that apartheid attitude of the Dutch, okay? So basically, this means that Papiamentu has a very special place. That's why it's an interesting language to talk about in this particular venue, also because this is the year of Papiamentu, but there's another reason why too. Okay, there are two. Well, first of all, Papiamentu has a very special history of a long history of translation and reading and writing, but also Papiamentu is an Iberian lexifier Creole, so the words are coming from Spanish and Portuguese, so there's no way you can consider Papiamentu to be a broken form of Dutch, which is the official language. In Jamaica, yes, you can say, oh, well, Jamaican Creole, oh, that's just broken English. Or in Haiti, you can say, oh, yes, well, Haitian Creole is just broken French. You can say that, although it's false, because the official language has the same words as the Creole language. But in Aruba, Curaçao, and Bonaire, you can't say that, because the official language is Dutch, and the words are coming from another language. So that gives Papiamentu a little more space in this respect. So by the end of by the 1800s, the Dutch model for militarized regimes of racialized slavery and capitalist sugar production was failing. Haiti had blown up, and Suriname and Jamaica were ungovernable. Okay? So the British said, look, we have to do something different. So what the British did was, from the 1800s, they changed their colonial discourse, okay? From the old Dutch discourse of the white man's divine right to enslave and expropriate, which is what the Europeans did from the 1600s onward to the 1800s, they changed their discourse. Oh, no, 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 we're not here to take your land away or to enslave you. We're here to civilize you. It's now the white man's burden to civilize the people in the colonies. So the discourse changes. Why does the discourse change? Because we're moving from coercive force of chattel slavery to discursive force. Get people to control themselves through discourse, through language. And how do you do that? You have to get the enslaved into the church and into the schools, because it's in the schools where you learn to internalize the discourses of domination of the society, and in the churches. So this idea of the Dutch to keep the enslaved out of their churches and away from their language was not going to work anymore. So the Dutch, after this period, said, okay, we're going to change our policy now. Okay, now you can learn our language. Now you can learn our religion too. You can become Calvinists just like us. But it was too late. The enslaved peoples, the African descended peoples of Aruba, Curaçao, and Bonaire were already Catholics and were already speaking Papiamentu. Okay, and this means that Papiamentu has a very special place and is an inspiration to all of the speakers of Creole languages in the Afro-Atlantic, for the whole Afro-Atlantic, whether in Africa or the Caribbean. So right now, Papiamentu is an official language in Aruba and Curaçao. Also, on the ABC Islands, you have these people doing incredible experimental programs in the schools, because the schools are still mainly taught in Dutch. But now people are changing the schools so that the schools are teaching the children in Papiamentu first. And there's a really interesting program going on in Aruba, which is sponsored by the Instituto Pedagógico Arubano. That's the teacher training institute of Aruba, which is called School Multilingual. And in the Escola Multilingual, Papiamentu replaces Dutch as the language of instruction, but not to exclude Dutch, but to eventually include Dutch and English and Spanish as languages that the students master in terms of reading, writing, and all their academic work. So again, we're not doing this European thing of it's either one or the other. Oh, nice. Yes, we're not doing this European thing of doing one or the other. That's to wake you all up. We're doing this thing about, yes, you can have them all, okay, which is very West African. You don't have to decide between one or the other. Let's have them all, okay? Very indigenous Caribbean as well. Let's have them all. Okay, so once the agency of marginalized peoples is taken seriously in our analyses, it becomes possible to reconceptualize creolization in the Atlantic as a dynamic process shaped by a multiplex matrix of influences, not just universals or the languages of the European elites. As suggested by Elaine, it is only when such multidimensional scenarios are envisioned that anything approaching a comprehensive understanding of creolization can be achieved. There can be no meaningful understanding of colonial history, society, language, and culture without acknowledging the significant historical, social, linguistic, and cultural agency of Africans, the enslaved, Maroons, Jews, renegades, women, indigenous, and other marginalized peoples in the creation and propagation of the creolized languages and cultures of the Caribbean and the rest of the Afro-Atlantic world. Thank you. Yes, we have a half hour for questions. So if anybody has questions, I think either will give you the microphone and you can ask questions on camera. Yeah, I'll repeat the question too. Questions, comments? Yeah. Please take the microphone. And sorry.
My name is Gabriel Rivera I study history here at the Faculty of Humanity, and I'm very interested in the study of the Caribbean. I think your work, or how did you say this work was done? Like it was you and a couple of students, right?
Well, some of them are here. Chandi is just leaving. She's one of the main people in that research group for many years. She was a main part of that, and she did her dissertation on one aspect of this, Maroons. And she had a very interesting concept. When women did these garden plots and did these markets, she called it virtual marronage. And this shows the subtle ways that women resist. You know, men are like carrying the swords and shooting, but women are often doing it in a way that's actually much more effective. And their subversion was, and so that's one person. Aida has looked at West African languages and how they line up. Let's see, so we have people here who have worked in this group, plus people who are now starting to work in this group, like some of the students who just come in.
Voy a aprovechar para hacer una mención. Papiamentu, Papiamentu es una de las lenguas criollas, pero también yo enseño creol haitiano. Y ahora mismo estamos dando un curso en un instituto de tutorías aquí en Santurce. Así que si quieren saber más sobre eso, hay una página en Facebook que se llama Haití Puerto Rico, que quiere decir la Casa de Haití en Puerto Rico. Si les interesa más sobre el tema, no solo hablamos enseñamos la lengua, sino que hablamos de la pertinencia histórica, cultural, la historia de Haití, así que aprovecho para la nación.
Yes,
Ahora mismo estamos dando el curso y lo seguimos dando.
So the question he had was, how long has this group been in existence and what have you been doing and who's participating? So what I answered was, just so that they could hear it on the camera, because they can't hear it from there. And so the answer was that actually this group has been going for more than 10 years and that you're all welcome to join. And also some of the people who've been working in the group are actually here present. And then what Candida Gonzalez Lopez just announced is that she, after she's now gotten her PhD from our program, she is now teaching Haitian Creole. So anybody who wants to learn Haitian Creole, please contact her. She has a web page, and if you're interested, please contact her through there. Yes, please continue.
And well, like the development of the question, I thought it was very interesting the concept of like the women and gave way to revolts, and because like I recently have been doing a lot of readings on the Haitian Revolution, and I've never seen that, you know, that concept being brought, and I think it's very, very relevant for Haiti right now, because like some studies as those of sentiments have, you know, showed that right now women in the rural areas of Haiti are still in control of the markets, and you know, it would be very fascinating to try to explain the Haitian Revolution from that aspect.
Yes, and so this is typical. No, when you read the books, women are erased, women are invisible, right? And so when you start to just scratch the surface, you see so much that women were doing. So there are scholars, some of the ones that I quoted there, like Mayer, etc., Tomich, that have actually written about this. Not specifically for Haiti. I think some of them do for the French Caribbean, but for Martinique, Guadeloupe. But I'm sure when you go to the archives, you'll find a lot. And you can ask Candida as well, because she wrote about the revolution and the role of, to a certain extent, women as well, but not so much as market women, but as practitioners of Vodou, because she looks at that aspect too. And I really didn't have time to talk about the spiritual side of this too, but that's also fascinating too. There's so many stories here that are so interesting, but we don't get them through the texts that we normally are exposed to. So yes, what you're doing is very important, and it needs. And if you can find a way to integrate some of those stories, and you can. And one of the things that we've done is actually look at what's going on the ground today and try to extrapolate back. And like you said, up until today, women are in charge of markets in Haiti. So is that something new or something that's happened over hundreds of years? And not just in the rural areas though, but also in Port-au-Prince. Also, most of the people selling on the streets are women. And if you, I'm sure if you did a study of how those women organize themselves in Port-au-Prince and in the rural areas, they have really interesting networks of mutual support and all kinds of ways that they make the market serve the community rather than just serve one person, the things that usually happen when men are in control of markets. Yeah.
Profesor Gabriel de Estudios Hispánicos, siempre es fascinante escucharlo. Vengo escuchando, valga la redundancia, el vocablo, el concepto de Papiamentu, y creo que nunca lo había entendido tan bien hasta hoy, así es que gracias por esa breve introducción. Me llamó la atención o me da curiosidad saber ¿cuánto ha evolucionado ese Papiamentu desde el 1800 hasta ahora?
Okay, so the question is, how has Papiamentu evolved from the 1800s until now? Considerably. So Papiamentu is one of the biggest success stories because of the work of the institutions that I mentioned, the IPA, the Instituto Pedagógico Arubano, the University of Curaçao. And now the University of Aruba is becoming involved in a major way. And people who've given their lives, really. I'm privileged and honored to work with such wonderful people in Aruba, Curaçao, and Bonaire who've really given their lives to the promotion of Papiamentu and are making the changes happen. But they're writing grammar books, they're writing literature. There's all kinds of literature in Papiamentu that goes all the way back to the 1800s. Plays, theater plays, poems, novels, translations of things from other languages. There are whole sets of books that can be used in the schools for the different subjects. Not complete sets yet, but they're getting there. Books to teach Papiamentu for reading and writing. It's amazing what they're doing. And it's a real inspiration to people who speak other Creole languages that haven't gotten there yet and are trying to get there. But they're also doing things that maybe are less tangible, but just as effective. So there's a whole NGO, non-government organization, in Aruba called Bonochi Drumidushi. Bonochi, buenas noches, Drumidushi. Duerme dulce, okay? Buenos sueños, huh? Okay. And what do? They go from house to house and read bedtime stories to the children in Papiamentu. Because a lot of parents don't have time, or the parents may feel like, I can't read. Okay, so they go from house to house and read to the kids in Papiamentu. Can you imagine what effect that has on the society? So it's amazing to work with the people that I work with in Aruba and Curaçao and Bonaire. I feel so honored to work with them, working with a very great and dedicated group of people. And I was just there last week. I was in Aruba last week. And now they're trying to introduce Papiamentu into the universities. Okay, so they've done some work in primary school, and now they're looking to finish their work in the secondary school and get it up into the university level now. So, and the week before that, I was in Curaçao, and there as well, they're working on the same kind of thing, especially at the level of the secondary school. So things are moving. So these are very, very inspiring places to work. I've been working in a lot of other places where Creole languages are spoken, in West Africa and in the South Pacific. And compared to what's happening in the South Pacific and West Africa, I could say that actually Papiamentu is quite advanced. It's quite advanced. Quite advanced. We still have a little bit more time for questions. Maybe you could ask your neighbor if they've got a question. Just ask your neighbor if they got any questions, so we can make sure that all of your questions and comments are addressed. Ask your neighbor. Yeah, you got 3 there, you got 2 there, 2 over there. Just ask your neighbor if there's anything that they missed or something that's not clear, because I went over a lot of material over the last 2.5 hours. Yes. Yes.
Which archives are you guys working on?
Which?
Archives.
Archives.
Okay. From which countries?
So the question is, which archives were we working on? You know, surprisingly, we have lots of archives right here. So we've, a lot of the stuff we have found was the product of research that people came from other islands to do right here in Puerto Rico. So Peter Roberts, for example, who will be here at the beginning of October this year, he got a sabbatical from the University of the West Indies in Cave Hill in Barbados, and he came here and spent a year, and he found things about the whole Caribbean here right in our archives. So a lot of the stuff we talked about, especially this idea that when the Dutch and the English took over from the Spanish and the Portuguese, they had this attitude that the Spanish and Portuguese had allowed their languages and cultures and their whole colonial project and their bloodlines to be contaminated by indigenous people in Africa. We got that original idea from the work that he did right here in your own archives. But we have other people who've done the archives in Britain. We have one person who did research, Sally Delgado, who worked on pirates, the speech of pirates on these ships, and in this period. She went to the archives in Bristol, Liverpool, and London. Then we've had people who've gone to Santo Domingo. So the work that we did on indigenous languages. So we always wondered about the indigenous people in the Caribbean, because nobody talks about them. When they talk about Creole languages, very few people talk about indigenous influences. So we thought, let's look at this. And so Marta Viada, very early on, went to Santo Domingo and did some amazing work in the archives and found tons of stuff that actually, like for example, in the earliest days of Santo Domingo, there were more renegades and more Maroons living outside of Santo Domingo than actual Spaniards living in Santo Domingo, Spanish people, colones, people who represented the colonial regime. And actually, the same is true of Puerto Rico. Because if you look at Puerto Rican history, for most of Puerto Rican history, the whole island was out of control. The Spanish only controlled San Juan, that's Viejo San Juan, and a little bit of Santurce, and San Germán. Ponce was totally out of control. That was pirates, and that was contrabanda. And all the rest of the island were people of European descent, people of indigenous descent, people of African descent, living free of colonial control for most of Puerto Rican history. Again, something that maybe only a few of the people are talking about when you read your Puerto Rican history books, okay? Because the focus is always on los colones, the European descended property men, okay? And those are the people who are supposed to make history. But actually, Puerto Rican history and what's the real life of Puerto Ricans today is so much more about what those people were doing up in their fincas in la montaña than what was happening in San Juan and San Germán. You know, what makes a Puerto Rican a Puerto Rican? Not what happened in San Juan and San Germán. It's what was happening among those indigenous, African, and European descended people up in the hills, living their own, in abundance and subsistence economies, in control of their lives. Another question.
Hi, so you mentioned quite a few times during your conference that anyone would be welcome to participate in this group of projects. How could students participate? Okay,
so the question is about how can people participate in these projects? Okay, you're more than welcome to begin right now. I showed you these volumes and these conferences at the very beginning. Oh, I'm going all the way back to the beginning. Oh, I'm bringing back fond memories, right? Okay, let's go all the way back. Oh, now we're back to 1400. My goodness. Oh, yeah. Okay, here we go. Okay, right back to the very beginning. Yeah. Okay, every year we publish these volumes. So we have, many of our students have published. Many people in the audience here have already published with us. Okay, so you have anything about the languages, literatures, and cultures of the Caribbean in its greatest sense, including West Africa, including Toronto, London, all the places where Caribbean people are, the greater Caribbean, you're welcome to publish with us. Now, many of our publications, though, are presented at conferences first. So we invite all of you to attend this conference, which we hold in a different island or territory of the Caribbean every year, the Islands in Between Conference. But before you get to this conference, every semester, as part of the Conferencias Caribeñas, we celebrate a Simposio Caribe Plurilingüe. And this year, it's going to happen on the 9th of November. Okay? So if you can get an abstract to us by the 9th of November, you can present already. And what we'll do is, though, before you present, you can meet with other people doing research on the Caribbean and get some feedback from them. You present first here, then you present at one of these, then you publish in these volumes. Okay, so many of the members of our group have built up a lot of publications and a lot of presentations because of their participation, because that's really what this group is for. Okay, it's not for the big names. It's not for people you always hear about in the Caribbean. It's for the voices that aren't heard. Okay, so basically, if you have something you want to say about the Caribbean, languages, cultures, or literatures of the Caribbean, please come and join us and send me an email. My email's I don't think it's. I can give you my email, and I'll integrate you into the group. We have a Google group for that will tell you when the meetings are, etc. Yes, always welcome. All of you are welcome. Doesn't matter if you're in humanidades, sociales, any discipline. We've had people from ciencias, from naturales in the group as well, doing things on plants and all medicinal plants, all kinds of things. Health sciences as well, healing, spiritual healing. We also have people working on religion. So we have a number of people working on Afro-Caribbean religion, Santeria, Vodun, etc., etc. So, yeah. Okay, any more questions? Okay, well, I'd like to thank once again the Institute of Caribbean Studies for giving us this time, and thank you all for staying here. I know these conferences, these lectures are a little bit long, and I prefer more interactive platforms, but and I also prefer to move around more. I don't know if you could see from my body language, but I normally am presenting like this, okay, and doing this and that. Okay, but I have to speak into these microphones so the people who are listening to us over the internet can hear what we're saying. Okay, so thank you very much again, and I hope to see you at Caribe Plurilingüe on the 9th of November here, okay? Send us an abstract. I hope to see you present, okay? And eventually at our Islands in Between conferences, and then eventually I hope to see your name and picture in these volumes with your publication. Okay, so thank you very much.
Yo les quiero dar las gracias al doctor Faraclas por esta lección magistral, igual a la doctora Verne por haber participado. Los invito el próximo 11 de octubre, que tenemos un Caribe soviético, es la próxima conferencia en este mismo lugar, a la misma hora, a la 1. Así que esperamos verlo y muchas gracias.
Un anuncio para los y las que se interesan. Cada año vamos a Ghana con un grupo de estudiantes. Entonces estamos organizando el curso. El curso lleva un número de doctorado, pero los y las de bachillerato y maestría también pueden participar. Bueno, los gastos son más o menos $2,800, pero hay muchos estudiantes